This way.
Oh my
Okay.
God, I could.
Robin, we have 2 more minutes, and then we'll start. Okay, can we start? I'm asking the camera. I'm Hale Isfandiari, the director of the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I would like to welcome you to today's meeting, an assessment of Ahmadinejad's trip to the United States. As you all know, Iran has been in the news for the last 3 decades and continues to be. Just 2 weeks ago, President Ahmadinejad was in New York to take part in the UN General Assembly. In a bizarre way, he stole the show from all the other dignitaries present in New York. I don't think there was one media appearance that he missed. And during his visit, he met for breakfast with a selected group of journalists, and Robin Wright was present at that breakfast. And he also invited a group of what they referred to as American and Iranian American intellectuals to a private dinner. Ambassador Limbert was present at that dinner. And of course, he also made outrageous remarks, such as the assertion that 9/11 was pre-planned and orchestrated by the United States, and that there are no political prisoners in Iran, that Iran is the freest country in the world, and that people's human rights are not violated in Iran. So in order to really assess that trip and to look at whether he made the same assertions in the private meetings he had where Robin and John attended, we invited both of them to come and take part in this public meeting. Lunch will be served at the end of the meeting around 1:15 or 1:20. There is an overflow in the 4th floor, and we will take questions from the overflow too. An intern is going to be there to take the questions. I've asked each of our speakers to speak maybe for 15 minutes, 18 minutes, and then we will open the floor to your questions. I would like please to ask you to close your cell phones, and please no text messaging, not checking your email, whether it's on BlackBerry or iPhone, because it interferes with the live webcast that we are having. So, and, not under the table, not on the table. So please, for an hour and 15 minutes, accept to be cut off from the outside world. Our 2 speakers are both very distinguished Iranian specialists. Robin Wright is a journalist, author, and foreign policy analyst, and she is currently a USIP Wilson Center distinguished scholar. During her fellowship, she will work on her book, which was called Jihad Against the Jihad, which will probably get a new title by the time it will come out. And she just finished editing the Iran primer. And she will talk about the Iran primer for a few minutes before just plunging into her talk. We distributed the table of content of the Iran primer. I noticed some of you have picked it up. I think I will stop here with Robin and then move on to John, who is a distinguished professor of international affairs at the United States Naval Academy and the former Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Near Eastern Affairs Bureau at the State Department. And we are thankful to him for having accepted our invitation to bring his class along. So a special welcome to all of you who are in uniform here. I must tell you that when I was being interrogated in a Wien in 2007, occasionally I was asked, who were these people in uniforms attending your meetings? And I said, look, 3 months have passed or 5 months have passed. I don't know what your names are. Do you think I will know what the name of the people who attend my meetings are? So, Robin, you go first.
Thank you, Holly. As Holly mentioned, we've been working on a crash project that's called the Iran Primer, Power, Politics, and U.S. Policy. And it's an unprecedented project. It brings together 50 of the world's top experts on Iran, each to write on a different slice of Iran. It's all fact-based and analysis. The book will come out on December 1st, but we're also putting the whole project on the web free, and it will be available as of October 18th. Halle wrote a chapter on women. John wrote a chapter on the Obama administration. Patrick Clausen wrote a chapter on U.S. sanctions. This is a very distinguished group of people, but it's also only half Western and half from the Middle East. So we try to balance perspectives. Anyway, let me get to our subject today, which is Ahmadinejad's visit. This was the third time I've met Ahmadinejad in New York for one of these working sessions, twice for dinner with foreign policy experts and this one time with the press. It's also the fourth president I've had meetings with in New York during their visits to the United Nations. I actually was at the first one in 1987 when then President Khamenei made the first visit by a senior Iranian official to the United Nations since the 1979 revolution. And as I waited for Ahmadinejad to arrive for breakfast, I reflected on how much has changed since 1987, but also how little has changed. In 1987, when Khamenei arrived at the UN, he was a secondary political player behind the wily Speaker of Parliament, Rafsanjani, and well behind the then very able Prime Minister Mir Hussein Mousavi, who was a former architect turned technocrat, and who got Iran through what was the bloodiest modern Middle East conflict, an 8-year war, during which the price of oil plummeted as low as $13 a barrel. So the one thing that lingered in my mind from that breakfast was the way that the two bodyguards standing behind Khamenei had to come over because of the tape recorder bomb that had paralyzed his right arm. They had to come over and cut up his breakfast meats. And in many ways, he just seemed a weak figure at the time. How much has changed. He is today obviously the supreme power, not only the supreme leader. And both Rafsanjani and Mousavi have been forced to the sidelines. The interesting thing about the speech in 1987 was that the UN mission had told us in advance that this was going to be a very important speech, reaching out to the world, and even only nodding, but at least nodding at the United States. But the day before, the United States had hit an Iranian naval vessel in the Persian Gulf, the Iran Azure. The ship had been set ablaze. 3 sailors had been killed, and 26 captured. Iran claimed that it was merely a merchant ship. The United States said it had photographs of the sailors on the ship dropping mines in the Gulf sea lanes. Of course, this was at the height of the Iran-Iraq War. Needless to say, that's what hasn't changed in 23 years. And the fact that the U.S. and Iran are still confronting each other, only this time the gap is far wider and the issues, of course, much bigger. So that brings me to the breakfast 23 years later. And I would describe the breakfast and Ahmadinejad in 4 terms. The first one is that he was undeniably in charge. He appears more self-confident today than ever, despite the unprecedented turmoil in Iran a year ago. His answers were filled with crisp certainties, even when they were at minimum questionable in terms of his responses, occasionally misleading, and sometimes just dead wrong, as when he yet again talked about denying the Holocaust and wanting an international panel to look at what was the truth behind what happened during World War II. The second term I chose was unflappable. There was no question that seemed to faze him, whether it was on Iran's deeply troubled economy or on the raids of the opposition leaders in the previous couple of weeks, the opposition leaders being Mir Hussein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, the 2 kind of nominal leaders of the Green Movement. He was masterful at countering any suggestion that Iran faced any problems. On the economy, he said the Tehran stock market was one of the most active in the world, that industrial exports had tripled, that agriculture was showing consistent growth. He said that Iran had fewer economic problems than the United States did. On the opposition, he said the leaders were not facing any problems. They were free to publish their own news and views. And he said that they probably don't show up in public much because of their past behavior had led them to be embarrassed. On talks with the international community, he said he was always prepared to talk, as he had been in the past and as he was now. He said there's probably a good talk that mediation will begin again soon. He said there was never any need for interlocutors and that there was no alternative but to talk to the United States directly. And he called himself quite optimistic about direct talks with the U.S. He dismissed any prospect of military action, either by Israel or the United States. He said no one could clash with Iran, and he said there was no other way but to talk. The third adjective I'd use to describe him was undaunted by recent developments, from new UN sanctions to resumption of Mideast peace talks. On sanctions, he insisted that past actions were actually very useful to Iran in strengthening its economic independence and its industries. He said new sanctions would be very useful as well. He said the American sanctions were particularly meaningless because there hadn't been trade for such a long period. And he said that while EU trade accounted a total about $23 billion a year, that it was not a large part of Iran's economy and that others could easily replace them. On Middle East peace, he said that, oh yes, Iran wants peace too. Oh yes, there's no other way. And when pushed about whether he'd accept any deal the Palestinians accepted, which was some language that former reformist President Khatami had once used, he was quite clever, as he often is. He kept saying that the world must allow the Palestinians to choose their representatives for any peace effort. And if the elected Palestinian representatives were not included, that the talks would then go nowhere. In other words, no deal will work or be accepted, at least by Iran, unless Hamas, which of course was elected in 2006 in an election verified by the United Nations, was part of the process and agreed to the terms. The fourth adjective I'd use to describe him in the end was unconvincing. His claims grew increasingly outrageous as the session continued. Just three quick examples. First, on the disputed 2009 elections and the government crackdown, he said Iran had never had such open and honest elections. He said no one had been arrested without proper judicial orders. He said the security forces and the Ministry of Intelligence took no action independent of the judiciary. Secondly, he said Iran doesn't mind U.S. arms sales to the Gulf countries. He said Iran does not consider either these countries or their arsenals to be rivals or a threat. He said U.S. allies effectively had to buy American weaponry to bail out the troubled American economy. He even issued a warning and said that those who sell arms might find that if there's any political change in the country they sell these arms to, that they might end up in the hands of countries that turn against them. The third and the most unbelievable allegation was that the United States had never fought a real war, not in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan. He said, kind of flippantly, that during World War II the United States had dropped a couple of bombs, at which point Roger Cohn from the New York Times turned to me and said, "Sounds like he's never heard of Normandy." He said the reason there won't be a war with Iran is because the U.S. knows that taking on the Islamic Republic would be a real war. At the end of the breakfast, I was thinking back on, how we got to a state where a man who made these kind of allegations becomes president of Iran. And then there's a kind of secondary lesson here. And with apologies to Hale and John, who both heard this story, I thought back on the years when I covered the Iran-Iraq War from the Iranian war front. And I remember being struck in 1982 when I went down to Dezful, which was right on the near the Iraqi border, and it was where Iran had launched an offensive that had crossed into Iraq, pushed back Iraqi troops for the first time. And I was with a small group of foreign journalists, and a group of Revolutionary Guards came over to talk to my group, and one of them said, "Are there any Americans among you?" And I raised my hand because I know you can get more trouble from lying than from telling the truth. Meanwhile, I was thinking, well, it's been a sweet life. And they took me off to the side, and they huddled around me, and they wanted to know three things. Was Johnny Carson still on the air? Had Nebraska beat Oklahoma? And did Pink Floyd have a new album out? And the only thing that made them suspicious was the fact that I'd never heard of Pink Floyd. That would not be true, probably, of senior Revolutionary Guard commanders. I think one of the things that's so striking about Ahmadinejad, and is an important lesson, is that we have now seen a generation, almost a generation and a half since the revolution, and the emergence of a group of people in power today who emerged from that environment, who have no exposure or experience, at least at close range, with the United States, an officer corps that didn't train in the United States. And it's produced people who I actually think he may not believe everything he says, but I think he does believe some of the things that he says. I want to very briefly look at what's next, if that's all right, just a couple of minutes, because we're clearly at a very important juncture with Iran. Last spring, we witnessed the collapse of diplomacy, the last effort, first by the United States and the European Union, and then by Brazil and Turkey, to get some kind of deal with Iran, a short-term deal that would then open the way for long-term talks on Iran's nuclear program. When those collapsed, there was then movement in passing the fourth round of sanctions at the United Nations. The U.S. has assumed since this summer that, in fact, there would be new talks this fall. They've been working hard at a strategy to deal with Iran. And there are many who believe these could or have the potential to be the most important talks with Iran since the 1979 revolution. The State Department has worked on the possibility that these would happen shortly after the United Nations General Assembly opened last month. And the European Foreign Minister, Catherine Ashton, has been working very hard to try to get something going. My sense, however, is that Iran is in no hurry, to put it mildly, and is prepared to let this process of negotiating about negotiations drag on. The fact is there has been no response, informally or formally. All we have is the kind of language that Ahmadinejad used at the United Nations, basically in every setting. It may be that there is internal opposition. It may be that they're talking about what they could put on the table. That may well be part of it. It may not be all of it. Meanwhile, Ahmadinejad next week is scheduled to make a triumphant visit to Lebanon, and primarily to South Lebanon. During his 2-day visit, he is reportedly scheduled to visit Qana, where he will lay a wreath at the graves of Lebanese who were killed by Israelis, and Bin Jabal, the scene of the heavy fighting in 2006 during the war between Hezbollah and Israel. He's scheduled reportedly to stop at Iranian reconstruction projects in the south, and quite possibly even go directly to the border with Israel, where some reports claim he wants to throw stones across the border. Israel, not surprisingly, is reportedly responding by beefing up security along the border. So my fifth term to describe Ahmadinejad is that he is increasingly audacious in what he's doing, I think both at home but also in terms of the region and the outside world. One of the things that also struck me about the theatrics of the breakfast was the man sitting next to him, Esfandiar Rahim Mashai, who was originally, he was a long time friend of Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad's son is married to his daughter, and Ahmadinejad tried to get him appointed as first vice president, a move that was highly controversial even among conservatives, and he was forced to make him chief of staff. And during breakfast, he was sitting right next to Ahmadinejad's right, looking at him. And it was very striking to watch the two of them. And I wondered as I watched whether Ahmadinejad intended, as some of the reports out of Iran suggest, that Ahmadinejad may want to push him forward as his successor as president. So I got the last question in at the end of the breakfast, and I asked if he intended to, if he believed that Mashai was qualified to be president, and if he would support him as president. And Ahmadinejad was clearly taken a little aback, and he finally came back and said, "That's 3 years away." But I wondered if he was trying to pull a Putin, basically put his man in power so he could still be the puppeteer. I will close with one final adjective, and that is that despite all of his rhetoric and his audacity, I think Ahmadinejad also remains seriously vulnerable. And I think this fall will be interesting, arguably more for what goes on inside Iran than what goes on with the international community. Subsidies are expected to be removed this fall, the first in a five-year plan to cut back on subsidies that account for something like 25% of Iran's GDP. A container of bottled water is today more expensive than a liter of gasoline in Iran. And I think this could become a real political issue in Iran, on the premise that it's the economy, stupid. And I also think sanctions are biting far more than the regime likes to admit. Not necessarily the targeted sanctions, but I think the financial sanctions that the U.S. has engaged in that don't get enough attention are really hurting the regime. And finally, I think the most undercovered story in Iran today is the labor movement, that even though the Green Movement has been silenced, the labor movement hasn't. And you see often, twice at Ahmadinejad speeches and at other occasions, labor groups coming out and holding up banners demanding back wages going back 3 or 4 months, shouting, we want jobs, that there are real economic issues, and that labor is providing the kind of dynamism and leadership, even if fragmented, even if in bits and pieces, that the political opposition has not been able to.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robin. John?
Thank you. Well, Holly, thank you for those very kind words at the beginning. I was recently reading about a study, I think it was a psychologist at the University of California did, and she was looking to find the point at which flattery ceases to be effective. And her results were very interesting. Her results were, there's no such point. And of course, our Iranian friends have known this for thousands of years anyway. Much of the impressions and what Robin has told you about President Ahmadinejad, I share, so maybe I can cut my remarks short and we can actually eat earlier today. Pardon? No, the setting for this private meeting of about 55 people up in New York. He apparently has done this every year. It's the first time I had ever been to one of these things. There were about 55 guests, including academics, former government officials, think tankers, various people from the Iranian American community, and what I call, in general, the second trackers, the people who've done for a long time the so-called track 2 diplomacy with Iran. The session was scheduled for 90 minutes. It went on for 150 minutes, 2.5 hours, at President Ahmadinejad's wish, because he wanted everyone who had a question. He wanted to get them in, and clearly he enjoys himself. Excuse me. He enjoys himself at these sessions. He had this attitude of, give me your best shot. I'm here. Let me see what you've got. Is that the best you can do? And then he would come back with his answers, whatever you thought of his answers. Now, in terms of content, he certainly knew his lines. I mean, he's done this so much. He's done so many interviews. He's done so many of these sessions that he has his lines. He has his lines down very well. And whether the question is, he's going to go back to his talking points. About 80% of the questions were about the nuclear issue, and he again has his lines down on that. And finally, he even got tired of it, and he said, "Is there anyone going to ask me a question about something else other than the nuclear issue?" Because frankly, the exchange wasn't terribly productive. He made, I would say, two points. One was he spoke, and this is an old sort of third world theme. I mean, this harkens back to the 60s and the 70s. He spoke about the need to reform the way the world is run, the kind of new world order. He talked about mudiriyat jahani, the management of the world, and how this is done. And the current system with the UN and the IAEA and all of these other organizations is stacked against smaller countries like Iran, and it basically dictates to these countries, and they don't have a voice, and that this system, Iran objects to it, Iran does not accept it, and Iran will push for its reform. Second theme, and this kept coming up over and over again in different contexts, was you can't tell us what to do. You cannot dictate terms to us. If we are going to negotiate, we are not going to negotiate under your terms, your preconditions, and with you insisting that we agree to everything before the negotiation starts. And in one form or another, this theme kept coming again and again. Now, impressions. First of all, I thought, as I watched him, I said, I know this man. It's the first time I'd seen him, but I said, I think I know him. And and it wasn't because he was alleged to be one of the hostage takers back in 79. I don't honestly know whether he was or he wasn't. They didn't introduce themselves to us. No one came up to me and said, my name is Mahmoud, and I hope you have a pleasant stay with us. But when I say I knew him, I knew people like him. Many of the people who had been my students at university in Iran back in the late 60s, early 70s, seemed to think and speak very much as he did. Many of the people who were holding us in 1979, 1980, also had the same view of the world. Of course, many of them, people like Mir Damad and Bitaraf and Abdi and these people were actually his friends. I mean, he knew he knew them, and I think he'd probably may have studied with them. But there was a kind of combination of book smart, being very smart at your engineering lessons, and apologize to all the engineers in the room, but a kind of engineer's view of the world in which there is no nuance, there is no doubt, and there is one solution to every problem. That combined with a view of the world formed by very conservative, the attitudes of very conservative small towns in Iran. Many of my students that I had came from places like Kazirun and Darab and Fasa and Neriz and Abadeh, around Shiraz, and their attitudes, the world were formed by the views of these very conservative towns and their very conservative families. Many of them came from middle and lower middle class, very traditional families. But with studying very hard and being very book smart, they were able to get into the universities, which were extremely difficult, extremely competitive, and advance. And so my feeling was, I recognize this. This is not new to me. This is something I've encountered before, not literally, but figuratively. But there was also something else. There was a mannerism that made me uneasy, and I couldn't for a while figure out what it was. I mean, he sounded reasonable, he was soft-spoken, he was self-deprecatory, he joked with the people asking questions, and I kept asking myself, is this the new Ahmadinejad? And then I was reminded, and some of us in this room will remember this, I said, this reminds me of the new Nixon. And some of us may remember from the 60s the new Nixon, where Nixon would go on late night TV, and you could watch him being self-deprecatory and pleasant and soft-spoken and very open, and of course it was all coached, and it was simply a facade to cover something else. And once in a while, as I watched President Ahmadinejad, I saw something else emerge from behind the facade. And there was a kind of petulance that was there, this defiance that lay behind this new Ahmadinejad facade. It came through, in particular, when someone asked him about nuclear weapons. And they said, does Iran want nuclear weapons? And he said, no. He said, we do not want nuclear weapons. We oppose nuclear weapons on ideological grounds. Nuclear weapons are only for murder. They serve no political purpose. They are expensive. They're not in our interests. They're morally wrong, and all of these other things. By the way, he never mentioned religion at all in this whole 2.5-hour program. And then he said, but if we are to pursue nuclear weapons or not pursue nuclear weapons, that decision is ours to make. You can't tell us what to do. We will make the decision. Coming back to this sort of old defiance, petulance, any of us who've ever had the pleasure of raising an adolescent will know exactly what I'm talking about here. You cannot tell me what to do. I will do this, but we will do this for our reasons. And this will be our decision. Finally, Robin mentioned, and you've seen some of his more outrageous statements, including the one about 9/11. He did not make any of these statements that evening. But frankly, I was not, when I read about this, I was not all that surprised, because I think that in his circle, the people that he knows, the people that he deals with, ideas like that the United States was responsible for 9/11, are pretty widely held. And among those people he knows and the people he talks to, it's probably pretty widely held. I won't go into the whole question of conspiracy theories, because I think that's probably pretty familiar to most of you. In my own years as a serving official, as a diplomat, I was not in Iran more recently than 30 years ago, but more recently I encountered that idea and similar ideas, quite widely held. The difference being that many other world leaders would not say them in public at the United Nations General Assembly, because they would understand the effect that they would have on part of the audience. I think in Ahmadinejad's case, he didn't probably, I don't think he necessarily said these out of malice. I think he said something that he believed, and without any idea of what their effect would be. And to me, this gets back to this rather limited world, limited view that he has. So thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to questions.
Thank you, John. Question to this is what it is. I'd like to ask both of you the first question. John, you understood his Farsi, so you didn't need a translator. Did you feel any nuance in his answers, or he just came out, with an avalanche of words, which some were familiar probably to you, some were not, because, there is a new jargon and language which is very difficult to follow. At least this was my experience 3 years ago. This is, and whether that made a difference in the way he expressed his opinion. And to Robin, was the issue of human rights raised in that breakfast, or as John said in the dinner, or maybe 70% of the questions had to dealt with the nuclear issue? But what is important, I think, for Iranians now is the issue of human rights more than anything else. And then I would like to have both your opinions on the human rights sanctions. John, the language.
Okay, the language. No, actually, it was interesting to listen to his Persian because I learned a few new Persian words. I learned the word yarane, which is subsidy, which is I had learned as subside, but is now is a new. There's a new vocabulary. No, actually, there's been a lot of exchange over his use of some very colloquial and vulgar expressions in his discourse. In his discourse, I won't repeat them here, but his Persian. No, but he did not do that with his audience, and I will give him the credit that he did seem to have the tone of his audience right. Get the tone of his audience right. His Persian was clear. Maybe because he was working with an interpreter and he's used to he knows how to work with an interpreter, but his Persian was clear. It wasn't very literary. It wasn't, but it was clear and direct for the purpose. But what I did not hear a lot of new jargon, and I didn't hear a lot of these kind of vulgar expressions that he. Has been criticized for.
Human rights?
Human rights, there was one question about there was exactly one question about human rights. I wish there had been more. I wish there had been more. But to emphasize what Robin said, everything's fine. There are no problems. Everything is fair. Don't believe what you read in the don't believe what you read in the journals. Don't believe what the world press is saying about this. I wish he had been pressed harder on the subject. But again, he has his line. I think had he been so, he would have continued to press the same line that he was pressing.
He talked about the hikers particularly, and when pressed, and said that he'd asked for clemency for the young woman who was released, Sarah Short, who was released, and that he had intervened on her behalf, but he was dismissive. He said, they were trespassing on Iranian soil and they had to go through the judicial process. So again, he tried to portray that he played a positive role and that the system works. In terms of human rights sanctions, clearly it's an important move psychologically, but it's clearly not going to make any difference to the 8 individuals who were sanctioned. But it does signal that the United States is going to address that issue. The timing of it was a little unusual because you had the Omani delegation in Tehran just as the sanctions were released, trying to win the release of the 2 other American hikers.
Delegation.
The Omani, what did I say?
Iran.
Sorry, the Omani delegation in Iran, trying to arrange the release of the other 2. So, the timing of it surprised me a little bit. But this is something that the Iranian opposition has been asking the United States to do now since the aftermath of the June election last year.
Yes, please. Just wait for the mic. The mic is coming. Yes. Could I ask you to identify yourself, please?
Yeah, hi, I'm Bob Dreyfus. I'm with The Nation magazine. I was in Iran last June for the election. I talked to a lot of people there, especially among the Green movement, about the sanctions, and they all expressed the concern to me, including former ministers of industry and people like that the sanctions were having a real impact economically and also translating into certain political opposition that was building. I think a lot of the Green movement, was given some impetus by the need to get out from under the sanctions that even then existed. So my question is, and Robin, you touched on this at the end, but I wanted a lot more about the labor movement, about the bazaar, because sanctions are designed to take, in my opinion, a long time. I mean, you don't just have sanctions and then they surrender and throw up their hands. You have Lieberman now Senator Lieberman about, well, you have till the end of the year and then we've got to consider the military option. I mean, he's an embarrassment when he talks like that, I think. But don't sanctions take a long time? And then what is the impact politically? Like, what's the mechanism by which we get from the current state of sanctions to some sort of political impact over there?
Sanctions do take a long time. I covered the Rhodesian Civil War, and it took 15 years between Ian Smith's declaration of unilateral independence from Britain and his agreement to talks with the opposition forces, and that was only because the South Africans turned off the train so that the Rhodesians couldn't get their agricultural export out. So sanctions do take a long time, but I think that you also didn't have the kind of financial sanctions. Again, this to me is the most dynamic element of sanctions. And I think the fact that there are now well over 100 international financial institutions that are not doing business with Iran. I know of one banker in Iran who said that he wasn't doing business with other Iranian banks because he was afraid of being sanctioned as well. So there's that slice. I think the labor movement is something that's parallel, but not as a result simply of sanctions. It's a result of Iranian mismanagement. Patrick Clausen's the guru on that subject. But there have been, in the past year, there have been literally dozens of strikes. Some of them very small, but they have persisted, and they have affected most of the major industries. They've taken place in front of government offices. I mean, if you look, I actually have a list of them. I've been keeping them because I think it's so interesting. There's been one in the oil industry, which is one place that the government has worked very hard to prevent because they understood what happened in 1979. That was when the oil workers boycott signaled that the regime really couldn't continue. So I think there are a lot of things. It's not sanctions that's doing. I think it's the mismanagement by the regime, and combined with a little bit of the difficulty of doing business, and therefore businesses can't expand or not hiring people. Unemployment is a growing problem, particularly among the young, and that's of course one of the two most dynamic elements of your civil society or opposition movement.
John, you want to?
No, Bob, you're exactly right about taking a long time, and the economic impact of these things is going to be very difficult to measure and predict. I mean, let's take a historical view. On the economic side, Iran has been confounding the experts for 30 years. I mean, for 30 years, the experts have said this can't go on. That the combination of sanctions, of economic mismanagement, of corruption, of the flight, the brain drain, the failure to invest in the energy sector, is going to bring this is going to bring this system down. It simply cannot go on. And people have been saying that. It's a little bit like like Zeno's paradox. They say the closer you get to it, the farther it gets away. My own view is that as long as there's $80 a barrel oil or $70 a barrel oil, the main impact of these sanctions, and I don't underestimate this, is psychological and political. I mean, most Iranians that I've talked to, and you have the advantage of me, Bob, because you've been there more recently. I haven't been there for 30 years, not by choice, but I'm just not welcome. But many Iranians that I have talked to, it's very clear they do not like being put into the same category as the Sudanese or other miscreants. Or North Korea, but particularly the Sudanese, for reasons that you understand, cut closer to home, or the Libyans, perhaps for the same reason. That gets back to what one of Ahmadinejad's themes that I mentioned about you must treat us with respect. You must give us the respect that is due to us. And this idea of constantly being singled out by the world as violators to be punished flies in the face of the self-image that this government carries. So when Hashmi Rafsanjani said recently, as he did, I think we should take these sanctions seriously. I have this idea that he's speaking maybe 1/3 economically and 2/3 politically and psychologically.
Sure. I'm going to take a question from this side and a question from this side. More cats? Yeah. And then there is a question from the 4th floor, which I'm going to read.
Thank you. Mark Katz from George Mason University. Robin, I was intrigued by your observation that Ahmadinejad felt that the U.S. wasn't going to get into intervene in Iran because it didn't want a real war. And I was just wondering, did you get the sense that he actually believes this? Because if he believes it, what it implies is that he really doesn't believe the U.S. is going to intervene, that it's simply talk. Or, in your view, was it more simply bluster? I'd be very interested in your impression. Thanks.
It's a good question. I wish I could answer. Honestly, I don't know. I had the sense that he really believes it, and that's why he's unflappable. He came across as particularly dangerous because I don't think he understands the realities. But he, when pressed on it over and over and over, and he seemed so flippant about it. This is a real war. I often describe Iranians to those who don't know them. If you know a Texan, I happen to have a cousin from Texas. He's impossible. And think of the most chauvinistic Texan and add 5,000 years, and then you get an Iranian perspective on things.
John, you have to.
I can't follow that.
Yes, please. Just wait for the mic. But please, I want very brief questions.
I usually say this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sheikh Ahmed Subhi Mansour, Muslim scholar and fellow at Woodrow Wilson. Ahmadinejad has become a hero in Muslim streets, even in Sunni Muslims who are usually, enemies to Shia. The question why Ahmadinejad has this good image in Muslim Sunni world more than even Muhammad Khatami, President Muhammad Khatami for this. Analyzing this will lead us to the very painful fact: the American foreign policy is responsible for this. It creates enemies and empowers them as if it needs to keep this country busy in unnecessary wars. This is my question. This is my answer and question. What is yours, please?
Thank you. Robin, you want to go, or John? American policy.
I'm reminded of as I listen. I'm reminded of a line of Persian proverb or poetry. The saying, it says, "Avaz dohol shanidan az dur khosh ast." The sound of the drum is very nice from a distance. People in other countries don't have to put up with him on a daily basis. They don't have to put up with his economic policy. They don't have to put up with his erratic statements. Maybe it's a comment on the difficulty of domestic politics, that when someone like that from a distance appears attractive. But I think from a closer examination would reveal that this thing that looks so good, in fact, has feet of clay.
I just add something very briefly, and I think that, in the Islamic world, we've been at war for almost 10 years, and there are a lot of people who are afraid, angry, whatever, and Ahmadinejad looks like someone who is standing up to the United States, and so he benefits from that.
And to Israel, if I may add to what you said, that is another reason for its popularity. Roger Hardy here at this end.
I'm Roger Hardy, a British journalist spending time at the centre. A lot of conservatives in Tehran, important conservatives, really don't seem to like this guy. They think he's bumptious, they think he interferes in foreign policy, they think he's mishandled the economy, and they don't much care for the for his chief of staff, this rather strange character that Robin described. So why do they put up with him? And will they go on putting up with him?
It's a great question, and clearly there is a growing and a deep and growing division in that critical sector of the political spectrum. Conservatives unhappy with the hardliners, unhappy with Ahmadinejad and particularly his political appointees. The Supreme Leader allows this to continue, and that's the way it is. Again, for the young, do I call them sailors? Are they sailors yet? Anyway, midshipmen, sorry. Here, it always reminds me of, for the hardcore who've been covering Iran for a long time, there's a wonderful joke in Tehran about if there are 5 Iranian Shiites, there have to be at least 6 political parties. That the divisions that they divide among themselves automatically. I mean, the revolution started basically as a one-party state, and today you have over 240 political parties, factions, movements, etc. And I'm surprised it's that small. So as long as the Supreme Leader allows this to continue, that's the way it'll be.
There's a principle of Iranian politics that I think if you keep in mind, it will be helpful, and that is no one ever leaves office voluntarily. You either die or are pushed out. And part of what you're describing, Roger, is I think a breakup or a split of this roughly 25 member men's club that has run Iran pretty much without opposition from 1979, and people like Khamenei and Hashemi Rafsanjani and Jannati, advised Tabassi, and others are charter members, and they have stuck around. And this group is either, maybe it's the effects of age or the effects of a new generation coming up, but this group seems to be splitting apart. And you see the kinds of conflicts and others getting that you would not have even imagined 10 years ago. Of course, the hard part to this is then to say, well, so what? What does this mean in political terms? What do these splits mean? And I think it's either one of two things. Either it's going to break apart the system, or it isn't. As our Iranian friends say, it's either one of two things, and you don't know at the end of the day. I mean, you can look at them, you can see these splits, but the political implications from them are very hard to read.
If I may add something to this. In the history of the Islamic Republic, there has been one case of impeaching a president. And I don't believe that Ayatollah Khamenei will allow this to happen again. So therefore, I think that's why after you heard rumors of impeachment or statements about impeachment in Parliament, he called the various factions for a meeting and said that the three powers in Iran should work together. So, and the argument of the government has been that these have been free elections, and Ahmadinejad that was elected with 65 or over 65% of a majority, so therefore he has to finish his term. That's how I see it. In the back, yes. I just wait for the mic, please. Yes. Yeah.
Right here.
Hi, this is Benjamin Rao. I got the impression that from everything that I've heard that Ahmadinejad is in a very strong position domestically. Could it be that the actions that he's shown so far is an attempt to hide perhaps a weak position within his own country?
Well, I think that's what I said at the end. I said I think he's still very vulnerable despite his bravado.
A question from the overflow to Mr. Limbert. You talked about Mr. Ahmadinejad stressing that the international community cannot dictate its term to the Iranian government. Are the Iranian people in a position to dictate their views to the government?
Good question. Probably would like to be, and maybe for the last 100 years or so, there has been an ongoing struggle to do exactly that, to restore some kind of balance between rulers and ruled. What you see today, and I didn't hear anything or see anything, because we're supposed to be talking about President Ahmadinejad's visit, but I didn't hear or see anything in what he said that suggested he or those people, his allies, were going to be more open and more accepting of views of other segments of society, particularly intellectuals, particularly journalists or lawyers or human rights activists or filmmakers, these and others who have raised questions about his and other policies of the government. That tension, I think, will continue.
Robert, do you have anything to add? Yes, please. Yeah.
Nick Naroditsky, Georgetown University and the Heritage Foundation. I have a question regarding two things that were said. The first was this idea that the sanctions are helping Iran's industry and Ahmadinejad's engineering perspective. There's a lot of indication that says that the oil industry, the oil and gas industry, is suffering pretty tremendously. The oil fields are regressing in terms of capabilities of production at 7 to 11% a year, which means that they might be pulling up nothing very shortly. Do you think that maybe you had mentioned the sanctions? Do you think that maybe the biggest danger is the lack of technological imports into the country? The country is very, very far behind in terms of exploration, in terms of development, and in terms of refining the downstream aspect of the oil industry. Recently,
brief, please.
Oh, sorry. That's the question.
Okay, thank you.
Look, I'm not an economist, and I would defer to someone like Patrick on that question. But I mean, it's been known for a long time that Iran's had difficulty with its refineries. Its oil fields are the oldest. They've gone through, a significant percentage of their of what they have. I don't know that sanctions short term are going to make a difference on the oil industry. They've actually cut back on the amount that they're importing. They're taking steps to try to, increase their independence. But, I'm going to fail you as giving you an answer because that's just not something I know a lot about.
Once again, I speak with great authority as a non-economist. But again, going back to something we mentioned earlier, that you see many similar analyses to what you said, looking at the state of the oil fields, the failure to invest in them, the lack of refinery capacity, the growth in domestic consumption, all of these things, and yet you can find these studies going back to the early '80s and looking out 5 years, and the collapse that people were predicting, or the sense that eventually that this group within 5 years will be what's the phrase, mugged by reality, hadn't happened. Which leads me to one conclusion, because I'm not as I said, I don't have a good economist view of this, but either that tells me that the Iranians are either smarter than we think they are, they're luckier than we think they are, or the people are much more long-suffering than we give them credit for.
Yes, please. Just wait for the mic.
Hossein Shabazi with Webster University. Thank you so much for your comments. You, Mr. Limbert, mentioned that you refer to the Ahmadinejad's defiance, and I think also you spoke to that effect as well. Now, I'd like to ask you about because one of the other themes that he pushed in his visit was the kind of lack of respect. I like to ask you what you see that point is playing in reality, and whether the U.S. government can do something about it's in public diplomacy or anything sort of that to kind of take away that point from Mr. Ahmadinejad and the Iranian government. Thank you.
It's a good question, because when the issue comes up about seeking respect, I mean, I think it's our colleague Barbara Slavin who says she says the Iranians think they're the Rodney Dangerfield of the Middle East. They don't get no respect. They don't get no respect. And listening to him speak, I asked myself the same question: how do you get at this idea? Because President Obama, when he has spoken repeatedly about the need to deal with Iran on the basis of mutual respect, but here's what I think here's maybe what's going on. The U.S. is talking about engagement based on mutual respect. President Ahmadinejad seemed to be talking about mutual respect and will worry about the engagement later. How else do you explain his idea that, yes, I'm ready to talk to the United States, but our dialogue should consist of a public debate with me and my American counterpart in front of the world media? In other words, in this way, the goal clearly in that case is for the Iranian side to gain respect, to gain status without worrying much about the content and the process of engagement.
Well, you want to? Yes, please. Just wait for the mic.
Thanks. Hi, Sonia Reinas Chivenidas with Search for Common Ground. Hi. I've heard a lot of people say, I really wish people would stop going to these dinners in New York, and why are they meeting with him? And I've been at the dinner for the third year now. John, the question's for you. I'm curious to know why you decided to go, and what did you say to people who discouraged you from going?
Sonia, it's nice to see you. Nice to see you here. I hope I wasn't too far off in what I hope you recognize we were at the same event. Actually, no one tried to discourage me. Including former colleagues from the government, from the Department of State. They never said don't go. They never said don't go. They said, go. Sounds interesting. I went because my wife told me to go, and I always do what my wife tells me to do. But again, if we don't, it's the old thing. We and the Iranians have not spoken to each other. We have not listened to each other. I'm reminded a little bit of an interview some of you may have heard that Ambassador Ron Newman gave a few weeks ago about Afghanistan, and the reporter asked him, well, how do you deal with President Karzai? How did you deal with implication being someone as difficult as President Karzai? And he said, I listened to him. What a revolutionary idea, that we actually listen to what the other side says. Not that we agree with it, not that we necessarily accept it or like it, but at least listen. Because if we're not listening to people, I mean, if we can always talk to our friends, of course, but if we don't listen to people who disagree with us, we're going to end up, I think, in a very bad place.
Let me thank our two speakers for their wonderful presentation, and they were very candid in answering the question. And please join us for lunch. Thank you. Lunch is served outside.
Thanks, Robert. It's good. I think we had the same. I guess it's good we had some of the same impressions.
I think we did. Unreality?
Or facade.
Yeah, of course there's.
See, there's a little substance. It's just a window.
I'm reminded.